At 8:14 a.m. on August 6, 1945, Dr. Yoshio Nishina sat inside his laboratory at the Riken Institute in Tokyo, roughly 500 m from Hiroshima. He was Japan's foremost nuclear physicist, a man who had once studied under Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, mastering atomic theory as deeply as anyone alive. For the past 3 years, he had led Japan's secret atomic bomb effort, code-named NIGO. That morning, as he had done every day since 1942, he worked tirelessly on the impossible challenge of uranium enrichment. Nishina had run the calculations countless times. To create an atomic bomb, one needed about 50 kilograms of uranium-235, yet this isotope accounted for barely 0.7% of natural uranium, the rest being nearly useless uranium-238. Separating these almost identical isotopes demanded technology far beyond their reach. The thermal diffusion method his team had devised could produce only microscopic quantities. They had grams. They required kilograms. At their existing pace, success was decades away. That was why Nishina had continually assured the Imperial Japanese Army that, though an atomic bomb was theoretically possible, no country could construct one during the war. The scale of industry required was simply astronomical. The Americans, he reasoned, faced the same physical limits. They might command greater resources, but physics bowed to no empire. Uranium-235 would not separate any faster in the U.S. than in Japan. He was tragically mistaken. At that very instant, only 500 m away, the Enola Gay was closing in on Hiroshima from 31,000 feet. In its bomb bay rested Little Boy, a uranium-235 gun-type fission bomb containing 64 kilograms of uranium-235 enriched to 80% purity. That was more refined uranium than Nishina believed could possibly exist anywhere on Earth in 1945. The Americans had accomplished what Nishina thought unachievable. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a city that officially did not exist. There, they built the WWII electromagnetic separation plant, sprawling across 825 acres, filled with 1,152 kilonewtons, gigantic electromagnetic separators applying mass spectrometry principles on an industrial scale. Each demanded immense magnetic coils. To build them, the U.S. Treasury lent 14,700 tons of silver. Since copper was prioritized for the war, Oak Ridge employed 75,000 workers, most unaware of what they were producing. The entire city had risen in secret in 1943. While Nishina toured with lab-scale devices in Tokyo, the Americans had erected entire secret cities devoted to atomic fuel. At Hanford, Washington, another hidden metropolis of 50,000 workers ran vast plutonium reactors. The U.S. had pursued multiple approaches at once, betting on all paths with an efficiency unimaginable to Japan. Nishina knew none of this, nor did any Japanese scientist. They had convinced themselves that America's industrial scale was irrelevant because physics itself set the limit. At 8:15 a.m. and 17 seconds, Little Boy exploded 1,968 feet above Hiroshima. The fireball reached 18 million degrees Fahrenheit within a millionth of a second. The shockwave expanded at 984 mph. That first second, 80,000 lives were erased. The mushroom cloud soared 40,000 feet into the sky within minutes. In Tokyo, Nishina remained unaware. Japan's communications lay in ruins by August 1945. Tokyo itself had already been devastated by relentless firebombing. The laboratory had survived, but news traveled painfully slow. The first reports were chaotic and uncertain. At 8:16 a.m., Hiroshima's radio station abruptly went silent mid-broadcast. Military communications from the city ceased altogether. Early accounts suggested a massive conventional air raid, yet something didn't add up. There had been only 3 aircraft. A typical B-29 bombing run involved hundreds of planes. 3 bombers couldn't possibly unleash such devastation. By noon, fragmentary messages trickled into Tokyo. Witnesses spoke of an immense explosion, a blinding flash brighter than the sun, and a towering cloud that climbed into the stratosphere. Reinforced concrete buildings had been vaporized at ground zero. Human beings had been reduced to shadows seared into stone walls. Nishina listened with growing dread. He instantly recognized what others could not. These accounts matched the exact theoretical characteristics of a nuclear detonation. Yet his logical mind rebelled. It couldn't be true. The Americans could not have built a bomb. His equations had proven it was impossible. By 2 p.m., The Imperial Japanese Army had dispatched investigation teams, including several of Nisha's colleagues from the Riken Institute. They carried Geiger counters and radiation measuring instruments. If this was indeed an atomic blast, the radiation levels would confirm it beyond doubt. Meanwhile, within the damaged walls of the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito received the same confused reports. The High Command was divided. Some generals claimed it was American propaganda that Hiroshima had fallen to conventional firebombing. Others weren't so sure. They turned to their scientists for clarity. Nisha was summoned immediately. As he navigated the bomb-scarred streets of Tokyo toward the military command center, his thoughts spun through equations. The energy yield described, at least 15 kilotons of TNT, aligned almost perfectly with the uranium bomb's theoretical output. But that would require an enormous quantity of enriched uranium, something he still believed could not have been achieved during wartime. Inside the command center, officers surrounded him, demanding answers. Was this truly an atomic bomb? Could the Americans have produced one? How many more might they possess? Nisha, disciplined by years of scientific rigor, refused denial. He told them the truth they feared, based on all available evidence. Yes, this was almost certainly a nuclear explosion. The flash temperature, blast pattern, and mushroom cloud all fit atomic models with horrifying accuracy. Then came his second fatal misjudgment. He reasoned aloud that if the Americans had managed to construct even a single bomb, it must have exhausted their entire uranium supply. A second weapon, he assured them, would take months or years to produce. Japan, he said, still had time to negotiate surrender. He was tragically mistaken once again. At that very hour, the Americans already possess another weapon, Fat Man, a plutonium implosion bomb, awaiting deployment on Tinian Island. By August 7th, Nisha's investigation team finally reached Hiroshima. What they witnessed defied belief. Dr. Junis of Soda, one of Nisha's brightest protégés, walked through the ashes as his Geiger counter screamed incessantly. The readings were unmistakable. This had been a nuclear detonation. Yet the devastation surpassed anything their models had ever imagined. They had never fully accounted for thermal radiation, the firestorms, or the creeping radiation sickness already killing thousands. Asada began gathering samples of fused sand and glass, evidence of a scientific nightmare made real. And metal. When exposed to the unimaginable heat of an atomic blast, ordinary sand liquefies and fuses into glass. Asada discovered this greenish, glass-like material scattered everywhere near ground zero. He calculated that the temperature required to create it exceeded 3,000 degrees Celsius, undeniable proof of atomic fission. But the most damning confirmation came from spectroscopic analysis. By studying the radiation patterns and isotopic composition of the debris, Asada identified the bomb's fuel source, uranium-235, exactly as Nisha had theorized. The Americans had done what Japan could not. They had solved the enrichment puzzle. When Asada's findings arrived in Tokyo on August 8, Nisha finally grasped the true scale of their failure. The Americans hadn't produced a bomb through chance or luck. They had industrialized the process. The quantity of enriched uranium in Little Boy reflected a level of production capacity that Japan couldn't have achieved in 10 years. That evening, sitting amid his crude thermal diffusion columns, Nisha ran the numbers again. If the Americans had enriched 64 kilograms of uranium-235 to 80% purity within roughly 2 years, based on intelligence about when the Manhattan Project began full-scale operations, then their separation plant had to be at least 1,000 times larger than Japan's entire atomic program. The figure was staggering. It meant that while Nisha had spent years scavenging equipment and pleading for funding, the Americans had quietly built vast secret industrial complexes beyond imagination. And the implication was terrifying. If they could enrich uranium on that scale, they didn't have just one bomb. They could have many. Nisha began estimating production rates. If their facilities could generate 64 kilograms of weapons-grade uranium-235, then at full capacity they might be capable of producing another bomb every few weeks or months. There was no possible defense. No anti-aircraft gun, no fighter plane, no underground bunker could stop a single B-29 carrying a single weapon capable of erasing an entire city in seconds. On the night of August 8, Nisha composed his official report to the Imperial High Command, written with the clarity of a scientist with the urgency of a man staring at annihilation. He concluded that the Americans' technological capacity had been catastrophically underestimated. They likely possessed not just one atomic bomb, but an entire arsenal in production. Continued resistance, he warned, was mathematically hopeless. His report reached the Supreme Council for the direction of the war, the Big Six, early on August 9th. They were already in emergency session, reeling from the Soviet Union's sudden declaration of war after midnight. Japan's strategic position was collapsing on all fronts. At 11:02 a.m., as the Council argued over surrender terms, the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, detonated over Nagasaki. This time, Nishina didn't need evidence or instruments. The truth was self-evident. A second atomic bomb in 3 days confirmed his worst fears. The Americans possessed continuous production capability and could obliterate Japan's cities one after another. But for Nishina personally, the blow was even deeper. Fat Man wasn't a uranium weapon. It was plutonium. The Americans had not only mastered uranium enrichment, they had simultaneously developed a second path to fission weaponry. While Japan's lone Rizzo Star program had struggled with a single uranium design, the United States had built both uranium and plutonium production networks, a dual-track atomic empire Japan could never hope to match. Production reactors, yet another colossal industrial effort that Nishina had once thought impossible in wartime. They had hedged every risk with overwhelming capacity. Within days, Nishina received the spectroscopic results from Nagasaki's debris, plutonium-239. This confirmed that the Americans had fully functional nuclear reactors converting uranium-238 into plutonium, a second, entirely independent path to atomic weapons. The Hanford reactors represented another staggering engineering feat, proof that the United States had committed to atomic power on an unimaginable scale. As Japan capitulated and the occupation began, the true magnitude of the Manhattan Project became clear. Nishina learned that the Americans had spent $2 billion in 1945 currency, nearly $30 billion today, and employed 130,000 people across multiple secret sites. Dozens of Nobel laureates and hundreds of elite physicists had worked under its umbrella. By contrast, Japan's Nigo project employed fewer than 100 researchers, its entire funding insufficient to cover even a single month of Manhattan Project operations. The Americans had approached the bomb not as a question of if but how. They treated it as an engineering challenge, solvable through sheer scale. They built redundant systems, ran parallel enrichment programs, and poured limitless resources into every technical hurdle. When one process lagged, they built another. When copper ran short, they borrowed silver from the U.S. Treasury. When they needed more mines, they drew them from across the Allied world. Japan's approach had been the opposite, a purely scientific pursuit, rooted in theory and precision, assuming intellect could outmatch industry. Nishina had believed the laws of physics alone dictated what were possible, not realizing that industrial force could bend theory into reality. The irony was cruel. Nishina had once studied under Niels Bohr, one of the architects of quantum mechanics. He understood atomic structure as deeply as Oppenheimer or Fermi. Japan had produced brilliant minds, physicists like Hideki Yukawa, who would win the 1949 Nobel Prize for his work on mesons. The problem had never been knowledge. It had been capacity, an industrial chasm so vast that genius alone couldn't bridge it. After Japan's surrender, American scientists arrived with the occupation forces and visited the Riken Institute. They examined Nishina's thermal diffusion towers and his crude cyclotron. Their demeanor was respectful, professionals recognizing a peer, but Nishina could see the quiet pity in their eyes. His life's work fit inside a space smaller than a single building at Oak Ridge. One visiting American tried to console him, noting that his thermal diffusion method was theoretically valid. The U.S. had, in fact, used thermal diffusion in one of its enrichment systems, though it had relied mainly on electromagnetic and gaseous diffusion. Nishina's science had been right. What he had lacked was scale. But that truth offered little comfort. In war, correct theory without industrial might meant nothing. The Americans had not triumphed through superior intellect, but through organizational power, unlimited funding, and a relentless drive to make every possible method work. In his final years, before his death in 1951, Nishina reflected often on this catastrophic misjudgment. He had believed that American scientists were constrained by the same physical and material limits he faced. He had never imagined that a nation could overcome the barriers of physics itself or the machinery of industry. He had unknowingly projected his own shortages and limitations onto his enemies, assuming that physics itself imposed the same insurmountable constraints on everyone. What he failed to grasp was that America's vast industrial economy, even while waging a two-front war across the globe, possessed surplus capacity greater than Japan's entire pre-war output. The United States could construct entire secret cities in the desert, staff a single facility with 75,000 workers, and spend billions of dollars on an experimental weapon that might not even succeed, all while still manufacturing thousands of ships, tens of thousands of aircraft, and millions of tons of conventional arms at the same time. The atomic bomb had been a triumph of science, yes, but far more than that. It stood as a monument to industrial might so overwhelming that no other nation on Earth in 1945 could hope to equal it. Japanese scientists had consistently underestimated this capacity until the instant Hiroshima vanished in a blaze of nuclear fire. By that moment, their misjudgment had already cost hundreds of thousands of lives and sealed Japan's fate of unconditional surrender. In his final writings, Nishina admitted the truth. He had calculated what was theoretically difficult and assumed that meant it was practically impossible. He had never imagined that America would simply obliterate theoretical limits with industrial power. That failure of imagination, more than any gap in physics, defined Japan's atomic program and guaranteed its failure. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., Dr. Yoshio Nishina learned the most devastating truth of the modern age. In war, industrial capacity outweighs intellectual brilliance. The Americans had not outsmarted Japan's scientists. They had outbuilt them on a scale so vast that comparison became meaningless. And in that realization lay the defining lesson of the atomic era. In the race for ultimate weapons, resources, and organization triumph over elegance and theory every single time.